In 2002, 19 major European and North American museums unleashed the Declaration on the Importance and Value of the Universal Museums. This never-before-seen footage is from a secret interview with their directors and stakeholders to ensure a frank conversation and also, maybe, protect the identities of those involved. Open Restitution Africa has hired an actor to read the part of the Universal Museums. These are their excuses. This episode, we're privileged to hear from the horse's mouth. Ours is a rare interview with the director of the one and only Universal Museum. Today, she'll share with us why the West museums and governments have advocated against the restitution of our looted material culture and ancestors, why they're determined to keep them. We're also calling this episode A History of Excuses. I'm your host, Ngwatilo Mawiyoo. You might want to watch our first episode, A History of Theft, and our second episode, A History of Demand, if you're wondering why we had to make this interview happen. Ms. Tony Wallow, thank you for being here. I understand the Universal Museum is, as yet, unwilling to return any objects to their rightful owners. Why is that? Thank you for having me. One of the fundamental things about the Universal Museum, from its very inception, is its ability to bring together all kinds of peoples, cultures, and stories. Ours is an encyclopedia of sorts of our world, of our story here as human beings. Ooh!
In January 1759, the British Museum opened its doors, the first national public museum of the world. Initially, the objects were based on the founding collection of Sir Hans Sloane, scholar, entrepreneur, physician, who was connected with the best minds of his time. Our collection has always been about connecting people.
Am I right? I don't see... Oh, it's a game. Like bingo. To see whether your reasoning is corroborated with other advocates of institutions such as yours. Nothing to worry about. I'm glad you brought up the historical origins of the museums. A figure like Hans Sloane, father of the public museum, and others like him were essential to the modern museum as we know it today, correct? Yes? So the quiet part in this heritage you're referring to is a story of systemic oppression. This heritage was either financed by money from slavery, then colonization. In fact, a good number of the objects this encyclopedia you refer to actually paid for the military campaign to suppress and subjugate nations so that you could get into the real economic business of colonial extraction, right?
Bruh.
Well, that's very far from museum practice today. I'm sure you can appreciate that things were done very differently in the past. The important thing about the Universal Museum is that it's fully accessible, available daily at no cost to the public, at least most of the time, which includes local and foreign visitors. That is something we are very proud of. Accessible, yes. Could you tell us how many flights and visas you have covered these last 100+ years since you purchased or otherwise acquired these stolen goods? Does your museum visitor data show African citizens visiting at rates similar to their share of the world population?
Let him cook!
If it helps, that would mean 18%, or about 1 out of every 5 visitors to the Universal Museum would be African resident citizens. We don't provide that. Oh, you don't? Surely you at least provide invitation letters, advocate for migrant rights and open borders, and waive visa application fees for all who wish to visit their material objects held in your museum, since you hold so many, whether they're scholars or ordinary workers.
We can't.
What does the word accessible mean in your language? We are committed to extending the reach of our collections to less endowed museums around the world by way of traveling exhibitions and through lending agreements to extend access beyond the reach of our walls. This must be recent, as I recall you denying precisely this on at least one infamous occasion. In recent years, we have become committed to extending the reach of our collections through lending agreements. Culturally speaking, and this is just me speaking as an African, I don't tend to borrow things that belong to me from the thief. If that's a thing that you do in Europe, we can respect your wishes as far as your property is concerned. On the other hand, it would save us a lot of paperwork if you just gave people their stuff. We can't do that. Many of the objects are very delicate and require professional handling and care. Tony, which is it? Are you lending things or aren't you? Now that you're on African soil, I can ask you in my language. Unataka kusema vitu vimeundwa Afrika haziwezi ka Afrika kwa sababu ya hali ya hewa. Tell me about Europe's very stable climate and the very stable climate of the other Western museums you lend to and have you touring exhibitions in, please. What I mean is, we have very well-trained museum staff, climate control storage, the very well-trained staff who caused irreparable damage to the Parthenon marbles using toxic chemicals like arsenic to preserve cultural heritage. The climate-controlled storage that has had objects affected by mildew. I'll be honest with you, Tony. We, as Africans, are very concerned about the safety of our cultural heritage in the Universal Museum. Of course, Europe is safe. It's the safest place on earth. Our democracies have been stable for hundreds of years. Do not compare us to the war-torn and corrupt African country. Ms. Wallow, please. No need to get emotional. I think it's important to be honest and know the difference between what you want others to believe and what the truth actually is. Do you recognize these images? It's the Grassy Museum. What happened there? It was destroyed in the Second World War. How about this image? It's from Ukraine. Yes, it is. Currently at war with Russia. But Africa is very corrupt. I have more pictures. This diamond disappeared from the British Museum, as did this Greek head and this Chinese mirror and a host of other objects that were recently reported stolen, apparently by one of your own curators. Stop. We have more examples. because of the Universal Museum, these objects and your cultures are known and respected as part of the history of mankind. Please play number 4.
They became works of art in museums because Europeans said it's art. You know, it's not from Africa. It was not art. It was meant to disappear.
Ms. Wallo, why should Africans suffer the absence of their prized belongings in order to educate you? We know that these objects had great artistic value. Our ancestors made them. But you forget, they're not merely art. A quick example after this Frenchman's heart. How would you like it if we went to Paris's cemeteries and lifted the headstones and bones of Paris's elite, perhaps Oscar Wilde, and displayed these as art in a Mombasa museum? Even after 100+ years with these objects, you still neither understand nor respect them. Oh, that wasn't an isolated comment. I have this too.
Le drame de l'Afrique, c'est que l'homme africain n'est pas assez entré dans l'histoire. Jamais l'homme ne s'élance vers l'avenir.
I mean, I'm very glad that the current French president seems to be somewhat of an improvement on this subject, but it seems you still have a lot of strange ideas. So why don't you return our objects, some of which were created before Europe entered into history? But who would we give them back to? So much in Africa has changed. It's true. That has been one of your crueler strategies, waiting for things to change. Who shall you give our things back to? We have the internet. Figure it out. Use the same energy you used to steal them to return them. Honestly, even if we wanted to, legally, it just isn't possible. Tony. No wonder some of your peers choose silence. Because honesty is really difficult for you. The same way those laws were made, they can be unmade. The same exceptions you found for Nazi looted art, you can also create to return Africa's cultural heritage. You already have a draft. Despite what you may think, Ms. Wallo, we know about the process of passing laws. Some of us have already even passed whole new improved constitutions. Do not insult our intelligence, please. But if we do that, it would really cause problems. Oh, this one I know by heart.
What tends to happen with these questions is if you say yes to one, you suddenly find the British Museum would be emptied.
Is that your greatest fear, Ms. Wallo? Are you suggesting that the most precious things in your museums are things that your people didn't make yourselves? That you've only launched yourselves into the future on the backs of stolen goods from the rest of the world? Is this you?
According to the law, which I like to think of as Solomon's law, the one who loves the baby best gets the baby. The one who will pay the most for the baby gets the baby.
And you want to talk to me about corruption? I think the more important conversation you need to have is with your people about your values and priorities. But thanks for coming. It's been enlightening.
So we didn't speak with any of the actual directors of the world's so-called Universal Museums. But that's really what they say. Those are the excuses that they offer and have offered African victims, restitution activists, government officials, and museologists for a century. So we thought our energy was better spent speaking with an African expert who can help us better understand these issues. So I'm very pleased to be speaking with Professor George Abungu former Director General of the National Museums of Kenya, a globally respected archaeologist and museologist who has spent a lot of time thinking about restitution, about the Universal Museum, and engaged deeply with both African and Western museums.
Thank you so much for meeting with us, Professor Abungu. Maybe my first question for you is, what is the Universal Museum? Who is it for? Who does it serve?
The concept of Universal Museum was sort of constructed by a number of Western museums in the early 200s. I think there were 17 or 19 museums from North America and Europe. And it was like an ambush. They came up and they decided that they should be called universal. And their definition of universal was that they hold collections from beyond their boundaries of the countries in which they're located.
So even you, that time you were at the National Museums of Kenya,
Yes.
were not part of that conversation.
I was not part of that conversation. I was at the National Museums of Kenya as Director General, but I was also a member of the International Council of Museums, ICOM, which is the apex body that is the overall body for all museums in the world, of which the 19 museums were part of. Even sitting on that board, I had no idea. Later is when we were invited and we were told, okay, this group of museums have declared themselves as universal.
So there's no Universal Museum in Africa?
I don't think there's any universal museum anywhere. If there are universal museums anywhere, then there should also be universal museums in Africa. And the National Museums of Kenya, if you know it well, is a huge institution with over 1,000 staff. Some of these universal museums, the so-called universal museums, probably have 200 staff. The National Museums of Kenya has the largest collection of hominids, the hominid collection under one roof in the whole world. There is no any other museum with that number. It's got about 3 million, insect specimens. I think now there are 5 million, which is used for different kinds of things in entomology. And so it's huge.
Yeah.
I know if you combine with the Institute of Primate Research with 400 people, this is a huge organization. So how comes it was not part of that? What was the reason behind the declaration? Mm-hmm. What were they getting out of? They were getting out of the fact that people had started requesting for material from those museums. And so they were saying, we are universal. So if the British Museum says you're universal and your funding does not come from universal, from different countries, it comes from the British. You are responsible to the British government.
Yep.
Okay? Your laws are British. So how can you be universal? You are actually British. So the question of reclaiming or claiming to be universal to be able to continue to retain some of these very important items so that we do not get them back is an assault. It's like assaulting us in the present situation where we are trying to, decolonize the way in which we relate to each other. We're saying we are equal. We are one people, one whatever. There's no more colonies and all that. We have to talk as equals. And we have to revisit some of the injustices of the past that were done to us. Yeah. And some of the greatest injustices involve the taking away of things was so important to us. Something that someone like Bo, the first African and the only African who was Director General of UNESCO, when he made that appeal in the 1970s, saying men and women of Africa have heritage in Europe and North America that are so spiritually significant to them. This is what they're asking you to take back. But they're not asking you to completely open up your storage and remove everything and your collections and take back. They're asking you for things that are so important to them. Spiritually, symbolically, things that give them identity, that create cohesion, that bring peace, that remove the ruptures that they have. And I remember one time I was in I think it was in either Munich or one of the German museums, a major museum. And I went to this museum and we were being taken around. Yeah. And I went to this particular, exhibition, and there was a figure from DRC. It was a human figure with beard, and I looked at the eyes, and this lady who was the curator was saying, this is the most important object for me. But I looked at the eyes of that particular item, and it was as if it was looking at me directly in the eye and telling me, take me home. It was like a captive. I'm an archaeologist, so we are trained not to believe in that superstition and all that. But for the first time, I looked at an object, and it looked at me straight on the eyes. And there was that sense of, I want to go back. And you feel like you want to shed tears, but you don't know how to explain to these people. These are not just objects. We need to try to demolish that word, to deconstruct the word. We need to use our own language. So if an object, if a kigango is there, a kigango carries the spirit of the person, of an elder. It's like the person himself or herself. We need to humanize these particular objects that have been objectized by the museums. There's this issue sometimes that they say, oh, we don't know that they will take care of them. They did not take them because they were not taken care of. When they were taken, they did not. The reason was not because they were not taken care of. And secondly, let me tell you, in African situation, and I'm talking as an African, there are things that are made to live and die. They are not supposed to live forever. And the spirit lives in them and dies and recreates again. And if you hold that spirit, if you hold those things and you don't let them die and deteriorate and go, then that means that these are prisoners and the spirits are prisoners. And it is very dangerous. It's not good for the community because it brings ruptures and lots of other things. So what we will do with repatriated or restituted things is our own business. We may decide to take some into the lake and throw them in the lake so that they can live there peacefully. We may decide to take them into the villages so that they can be reburied there. We may decide, we don't have to museumize everything. Museum keeps things forever. But we don't have to do that if these things are so important that they need to transcend from that life that they were made into another life.
Is there a role for the encyclopedic or universal museum, like if you were to reconceive it, like scrap the one they have?
You are using that. I was going to tell you now they have changed from universal to encyclopedic, isn't it? Yeah. So yes, continue. What is your question?
Say we're to scrap the idea, and is there a universe in which such an idea is useful for us? And what would that maybe look like if you were to speculate?
You know, I've also written recently about encyclopedic, where I'm saying they are coming in a different clothing. It was universal.
Yes, same.
And we said, no, they brought this idea of encyclopedic. It's all that sheep that is wrapped up in the same thing. We don't have anything like that. The museum is a museum. Whatever color, whatever collection you have, it is a museum. It's a house with collections. And that's why we are saying we need to decolonize the museum. This idea of, grading different museums differently is not in our interest. The intention is wrong. The intention is to legalize an illegality because it has become encyclopedic and universal because it has stolen or it has collections that have been stolen from different parts of the world. And the intention is to keep them without any discussion.
Let's agree that we've just about had it with the West's excuses, games, and avoidance tactics. And by we, I mean us, our living dead and ancestors. So where are we now? Next time, we speak with the folks in the trenches, our people doing the work to bring us closer to restitution. Turn to your neighbor and say, "A luta continua." Share this video with someone who needs to know.